Airplanes are an amazing way to get quickly between two destinations that are relatively far apart. But some routes are so short that they could easily be replaced by other means of transportation. For example, by high-speed rail or even normal trains in some situations. I won't necessarily talk about the shortest flights in the world because some of them make sense. For example, in Alaska, you can't really build trains and there's not the population for that. I'll rather talk about big cities that are close apart together but still have daily flights between them. And it's not a top 10 or whatever, it's just some examples I wanted to talk about. We'll talk about the bad, of course, but we also talk about what we could do to improve the situation, which is basically often building some trains. The first one I want to talk about is in Canada, and it's the route between Montreal and Ottawa. Those two cities are quite big and quite important. One of them is the biggest city in Quebec, and the other is the capital of Canada. They respectively have 4.3 million people and 1.5 million people in their metro areas, and they are only 198 kilometers apart. I didn't calculate what's that in miles for my American viewers, probably about 120 miles. Anyway, it's very close together, but they still have a direct connection between them. And not only one flight, there's 7 flights per day. Flight time is only about 44 minutes, which is incredibly short, compared to about 2 hours by drive and about the same for trains. But that's very optimistic because trains in Canada really don't run that smoothly. So they all take about the same time, but actually flying is maybe even longer than 2 hours if you include the time to get to the airport here in Montreal and then out of the airport in Ottawa, and of course all the time you waste at the airport. Oh, and the worst part of that, the cheapest flight I could find is $400 Canadian dollars. So of course in that case improving the rail service between those two cities is a no-brainer, but fortunately things might be about to change. This year in 2025, the Canadian government announced the new high-speed rail project spanning all the way from Toronto to the city of Quebec, and of course there's going to be a link between Montreal and Ottawa in the middle, and this would probably decrease by half the travel times. There's estimates of it taking 59 minutes, which I think is a bit optimistical, but even if it's a bit more than that, it's way better than what we have today. So I hope that this connection in the future can reduce the amount of flights we have between Montreal and Ottawa. But I won't talk more about this project because I think it deserves its own video. So anyway, let's get to the next example. So now let's leave Canada and go all the way to Brazil. There are 2 cities in the northeastern part of the country that are called Recife and João Pessoa. You might not know these 2 cities, but they're quite populous. Recife has about 4 million people and João Pessoa has about 1.2 million people in their metro areas, of course. So it's very comparable to Montreal and Ottawa from the example before. From city center to city center, it's only about 119 kilometers, so that's pretty close. But they still have a regular daily flight between them, and it only takes about 35 minutes. However, it's worth mentioning that the drive between those 2 cities is pretty long. It's about 2 hours. I actually know someone that drove on this route exactly, and it took about this time maybe a bit shorter, but it's still a pretty long journey. And also it's worth mentioning that Recife has a metro line that connects directly to the airport, so that might motivate people to choose flying. But yeah, it would definitely make sense to have a rail connection between those 2 cities since they're so close apart, and there is no rail link, no passenger rail currently between those 2 cities. Actually, there is no intercity rail at all in all of Brazil, so there's a lot of work to be done there. There's a pretty extensive highway system there, so if you can build highways, you can build rail. Let's stay in Brazil. There's one more example there. It's Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, which is respectively the 3rd and the biggest metro areas in South America. Combined together, they have a population of 33 million people. That's almost as much as all of Canada, and they're only about 430 kilometers apart, so that's the perfect distance for high-speed rail, for example. They have the population and the perfect distance for that. The only problem would be the geography, but that's another topic, of course. There's actually currently a high-speed rail project between those 2 cities, but it's not getting built. The drive between those 2 cities takes about 6 hours, so that's very long. But let's talk about the flights, since this is the subject of this video. São Paulo has 3 airports. One is a bit further, it's in the city of Campinas, and Rio de Janeiro has 2 airports. And they're all linked together by flights, so basically every combination has a flight. So if you take all of them together, I could find 98 flights per day between those two cities. A lot of that can be replaced by some rail connections. As I said before, there's no rail connection at all in Brazil. Actually, yes, there is one I know of, but it's not between Rio and São Paulo. So yeah, the demand is definitely there. So I hope something can be built in the future between those cities. Now let's get back to North America and let's go to the United States. There's probably a lot of examples there, but I could find a very interesting one, which is the route between Chicago and Milwaukee. So for a little overview, Chicago has a metro area of 9 million people and Milwaukee has about 1.5 million people in its metro area. Those two cities are very close apart, only about 150 kilometers. That's less than 100 miles, about 90 miles apart, so pretty close. But guess what? They have regular flights between them, and not one, they have 13 flights. The very short distance between those cities and the population would be just perfect for rail transportation. There's actually currently a rail connection between the two and it takes about 1 hour and a half, which is not bad, but it can definitely be better than that. There could be a direct train, but also a train that stops like there is currently, which stops at 4 stops. That's a lot of stops in the same sentence. And also the frequency, from what I gathered, is not great. There are more flights than trains per day, so yes, this definitely needs improvement. And for the last example, let's go to Europe. Europe is well known to have a very efficient rail transportation system, but I was still surprised to see a lot of flights between cities that are close apart. For example, in Switzerland, there's Zurich and Geneva. Of course, these two cities are linked by trains with very regular trains, but these two cities still have daily flights between them. Which actually brings the question, maybe having great rail transportation between two cities still won't stop having flights between them. But for example, in the case of Geneva and Zurich, those are two very important cities in the global scale. So for example, let's take someone that wants to go from Hong Kong to Geneva. They might fly into Zurich first and then get a connecting flight to Geneva, which would of course be more practical than leaving the airport in Zurich and taking a train to Geneva. So in that case, it makes sense of why those type of flights exist. The problem is more about the people that only take the direct flight. So in those cases, it's very important to have an alternative, for example, efficient rail transportation. Because if there's no good alternatives to flying or driving, people will fly or drive. But while we talk about Europe, I think it's worth mentioning that France has banned some short routes, but the condition to that is to have a rail connection that takes less than 2.5 hours. I think that threshold could be increased a lot because there's a lot of cities in France that are left out. For example, cities like Lyon and Marseille are not concerned by this ban. From what I gathered, this ban only affected 3 routes, which all leave from airports in Paris. So I think it's definitely not enough and it can be improved a lot. But it's still a very good initiative from France and I hope some other countries can do that. First, improving the rail transportation, make it faster and more convenient, to then ban or reduce flights on some of those short routes that don't really make sense. But yes, anyway, that's it for this video. I could probably talk about more examples, but I can still make a part 2 of this video. If you got some examples, leave them in the comments and I'm gonna explore. If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing and leaving a like, and also some suggestions of topics I can cover in the future. But yes, anyway, see you on the next video.